The screaming started before anyone could see what was killing them. Out of the darkness, out of the tree line, out of the fog that had settled like a burial shroud over the western bank of the Monongahela River, it came. Not the orderly volley fire of European warfare, not the measured thunder of cannon set in proper formation, but something older, faster, and infinitely more terrifying. The men of General Edward Braddock's column, nearly 1,400 strong, the finest professional soldiers the British Empire could field in North America, had no framework for what was happening to them. They had trained for battlefields that looked like parade grounds. They had drilled for enemies who stood in lines. What descended upon them on the afternoon of July 9th, 1755, was nothing their training had prepared them to survive. Wait, you're right to pause there. The date, 1755. This is not the Civil War you were promised. This is something older, something that the American military establishment would spend not 50 years but closer to 2 centuries, quietly folding into the mythology of frontier inevitability. The idea that what happened on that riverbank was simply the cost of westward expansion, a minor setback on the road to manifest destiny. But if you look closer, if you actually pull the documents from the archives in London and Philadelphia and Williamsburg, what you find is a story of catastrophic institutional failure, deliberate falsification of after-action reports, the systematic destruction of eyewitness testimony, and a propaganda campaign so effective that even today, most Americans have never heard the name of the battle that killed more British officers, proportionally, than almost any engagement in the entirety of the 7 Years' War. This is the story of the Battle of the Monongahela. This is the story of Braddock's defeat. And this is the story of how the men responsible for it, and the empire that employed them, made sure the world would never fully understand what went wrong or why. To understand the catastrophe, you must first understand the confidence. And the confidence in the spring of 1755 was absolute. General Edward Braddock had arrived in Virginia in February of that year aboard His Majesty's ship Norwich, stepping onto American soil with the bearing of a man who had never seriously entertained the possibility of failure. He was 60 years old, a career soldier of the Coldstream Guards, a man shaped entirely by the military culture of Georgian Britain, rigid, hierarchical, contemptuous of irregulars, and utterly certain that European methods of warfare were not merely preferable, but universally superior. He looked at the American colonies and saw chaos. He looked at colonial militia and saw rabble. He looked at the French position at Fort Duquesne, sitting at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the site of modern-day Pittsburgh, and saw a problem that could be solved with sufficient British steel and British discipline. The mission seemed straightforward. Capture Fort Duquesne, the linchpin of French territorial ambition in the Ohio Valley, and break France's grip on the interior of the continent before the broader conflict that would become the 7 Years' War fully ignited. The British government had authorized 2 regiments of regular infantry, the 44th and 48th Foot, to be shipped from Ireland, supplemented by colonial provincial troops and ranger companies drawn from Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. With artillery, with supply trains, with engineering corps, Braddock's force would cut a road through the Appalachian wilderness, drag cannons to the walls of Fort Duquesne, and compel a French surrender. Simple, clinical, inevitable. Among Braddock's volunteer aides de camp was a 23-year-old Virginia colonel named George Washington. Washington had been to this country before. He had seen what the wilderness of the Ohio Valley could do to organized military thinking. He had fought French allied warriors in these same forests 2 years earlier, had survived the humiliating surrender of Fort Necessity in 1754, and had come away with a hard-won education in the particular brutality of frontier warfare. He tried to tell Braddock. He genuinely tried. Washington urged the general to employ more Native American scouts, to spread his column, to consider the tactical realities of fighting in dense woodland against an enemy that would not oblige them by standing in formation. Braddock listened with the patient condescension of a man who has nothing to learn from a colonial. He had fought in Flanders. He had served in the War of the Austrian Succession. He had stood on the civilized battlefields of Europe, where wars were decided by firepower and nerve, and the unbreakable discipline of trained regulars. Washington's concerns struck him as the anxious imaginings of an inexperienced provincial. This is the moment, right here, in these conversations between a rigid old general and a young Virginian who would one day build an entirely new nation, where the seeds of disaster were planted. And it is worth pausing, just for a moment, to feel the weight of that. To imagine yourself in Washington's position, young, deferential, acutely aware of what the wilderness ahead could do, and completely powerless to make the man in charge believe you. The march began in May, and from the first day it was agony. The route from Fort Cumberland in Maryland to Fort Duquesne, roughly 110 miles as the crow flies, but through terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to break an army, was everything Washington had warned about, and worse. The Appalachian Wilderness in 1755 was not a landscape that had ever been asked to accommodate an 18th century European military column. Trees pressed in from every side. Ridgelines rose and fell without warning. Streams cut across the route with maddening frequency. The road Braddock's engineers were cutting through the forest, literally building the path as they marched, required leveling hills, bridging gorges, and hauling artillery pieces that weighed hundreds of pounds through terrain where a fully loaded pack horse could barely keep its footing. The wagons sank in the mud. The horses, already underfed, already suffering from the hard Atlantic crossing, began to die in the traces. The supply chain, which Braddock had assumed would function with military precision, collapsed repeatedly under the weight of its own logistical ambition. Benjamin Franklin himself had been dispatched to Pennsylvania to round up wagons and draft horses for the campaign, and had managed to assemble enough to get the expedition moving. But moving and sustaining were two different problems. And the further into the wilderness the column pushed, the more the latter threatened to devour the former entirely. Braddock made a command decision. He would split his force. He would take the fittest men, approximately 1,300 soldiers, in a flying column, moving as fast as the road could be cut, leaving the heavier supply train to follow under Colonel Thomas Dunbar. It was not an unreasonable tactical choice given the circumstances. It was the kind of decision that looks perfectly sensible in a command tent and catastrophically wrong in the aftermath. By early July, the flying column had crossed the Monongahela River twice and was within roughly 12 miles of Fort Duquesne. They were close enough that officers were already discussing the terms they would offer the French garrison. The mood in the column, despite the weeks of grinding march, had shifted upward into something approaching excitement. They were almost there. The fort was lightly garrisoned. Intelligence suggested no more than a few hundred French regulars and perhaps some native warriors. With the artillery Braddock was bringing, the walls of Duquesne would not stand for more than an afternoon. What Braddock did not know, what his scouts had failed to discover, because his scouts were inadequate and his intelligence gathering was virtually non-existent, was that on the morning of July 9th, the French garrison at Fort Duquesne had made a decision of its own. Captain Daniel Hyacinthe Marie Léonard de Beaujeu, a French officer of extraordinary tactical instinct and personal courage, had argued passionately that the fort could not withstand a British siege. Waiting to be shelled into rubble was not a strategy. The only viable option was to take the fight to the British column before it could deploy its artillery, to ambush it in the forest, on ground where the advantages of European military discipline would be neutralized and the skills of France's Native American allies would be decisive. The garrison's Native American Confederates, warriors from the Ottawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Delaware, and other nations, numbering perhaps 637 men, were initially reluctant. Beaujeu appealed to them directly, reportedly appearing before them in warrior's dress rather than officer's uniform, asking them to fight alongside him as equals. They agreed. The force that moved out of Fort Duquesne on the morning of July 9th numbered approximately 900 men, about 250 French regulars and Canadian militia, and 637 Native American warriors. They moved through the forest with the particular silence of people who had grown up in it, who understood it not as an obstacle, but as an environment, who knew how to use every tree and ravine and fold of ground as naturally as a European soldier knew how to dress a line. At roughly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Braddock's advance guard, About 300 men under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, the same Thomas Gage who would one day command British forces at Lexington and Concord, made contact. Contact is perhaps too deliberate a word. What happened was more like collision. Gage's advance guard was moving along the newly cut road through a section of forest where the trees pressed close and visibility extended perhaps 30 yards to either side. Then suddenly, ahead of them in the road, they saw men, French officers in white uniforms, Native American warriors in war paint. And for a fraction of a second, both sides were equally surprised. Beaujeu died almost immediately. A British volley caught him in the first exchange of fire, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though the ambush might collapse before it had fully formed. But the warriors and militia around him did not break. They scattered, not in retreat, in deployment. They melted into the trees on both sides of the British column with the fluid efficiency of men who had been moving through this forest since childhood, and then they began to fire. Now close your eyes for just a moment and try to place yourself there. You are a British regular, trained on the parade grounds of Ireland and England. You have been marching for weeks. Your musket is loaded. Your uniform is soaked with sweat. Your sergeant is somewhere to your left. And then the forest itself begins to kill you. The fire was coming from everywhere and nowhere. From behind logs, from the crests of ravines, from the upper branches of trees. The warriors had taken the high ground on both flanks with startling speed, pouring fire down into the column from positions that the British couldn't see and couldn't assault without abandoning their formation. And abandoning their formation in European military doctrine was simply not something trained regulars did. So they stood, they dressed their lines. They fired volleys into the trees at muzzle smoke they could barely see, at enemies they could not identify, at a battle that had no shape they recognized. Gage's advance guard fell back in disorder into the main body of the column. Then the main body, hearing the firing ahead of them and unable to see what was happening, began to press forward to reinforce and ran directly into the retreating advance guard. The column compressed. Men packed together on a road perhaps 12 feet wide, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to see the enemy, unable to form the kind of firing lines that might have given them some defensive coherence. The officers tried. To their credit, and this is something the subsequent cover-up would work very hard to obscure, many of Braddock's officers showed extraordinary personal courage in those terrible hours. They rode up and down the column. They tried to rally their men. They tried to push flanking parties into the trees to drive out the warriors on the high ground. But to lead your men into those trees on that day was to lead them to their deaths. And within the first hour, the officer corps of the 44th and 48th Foot had been devastated. 63 of the 89 British officers engaged that afternoon were killed or wounded. 63. The proportional loss of officers in a single afternoon engagement was staggering, higher than almost any comparable engagement of the era. The horses were targeted deliberately. The native warriors understood that an army in the wilderness without its horses was an army that could not move its supplies or its wounded, and they shot the animals systematically with a tactical intelligence that the British, still trying to fight a different kind of battle, were too slow to counter. Washington himself had 2 horses shot from under him. He took 4 musket balls through his coat. He never received a wound. Later, he would write about the experience in terms that suggested he understood something supernatural had moved through him that day, but in the immediate terror of the battle, there was no time for reflection. He was galloping back and forth through the carnage, trying to carry Braddock's orders to men who were increasingly beyond ordering. Braddock was hit late in the fight. A musket ball passed through his arm and into his lung. He had already had 4 horses killed under him. He had tried to lead by example, riding into the midst of the battle with a courage that no one, not even his harshest critics, ever disputed. But courage and tactical rigidity are different qualities, and on the banks of the Monongahela, the latter had killed his army. His men carried him from the field as the retreat, chaos would be a more accurate word, became complete. The column dissolved into the road, men throwing down their weapons, their packs, their ammunition, running south toward the ford they had crossed that morning with the singular animal focus of people running for their lives. The pursuit lasted only a short distance. The warriors chose not to follow. They had won a complete and stunning victory, and the spoils on the field were considerable. The British baggage, the artillery, the treasury chest containing 25,000 pounds in campaign funds, the general's private papers, all of it fell into French hands. The road south was littered with weapons, equipment, and bodies. Of the approximately 1,300 men in Braddock's flying column, 456 were killed outright, and another 422 were wounded, a casualty rate of nearly 70%. The French and their Native American allies suffered fewer than 50 casualties. It was not a defeat, it was annihilation. Braddock died 4 days later at a place called Great Meadows, on the road south, the same ground where Washington had surrendered Fort Necessity the previous year. He was buried in the road so that the retreating army's wagons would pass over his grave and obscure it from any potential desecration. His last recorded words were reportedly, "We shall know better how to deal with them another time." The words of a man who still did not fully understand what had happened to him. And now comes the part of this story that the historical record has spent a very long time trying not to look at directly. The survivors reached Colonel Dunbar's camp on July 12th. Dunbar was in command of the rear column, the slower-moving force with the heavy supplies that had not been part of the flying column's doomed advance. He had approximately 1,500 men, sufficient artillery and ammunition to mount a credible defense, and, critically, sufficient forces to present a meaningful obstacle to any French follow-up offensive. Fort Duquesne's garrison, despite its extraordinary tactical victory, was numerically small. The Native American warriors who had turned the tide of battle were already beginning to disperse back to their own territories, as was customary after a successful engagement. The French were not in a position to launch an immediate large-scale offensive. Dunbar destroyed everything anyway. He ordered the remaining artillery smashed. He ordered the powder burned. He ordered the surplus wagons destroyed and the supplies dumped. And then, with the remnants of Braddock's army, he retreated. Not to a defensible position in western Pennsylvania, not to Fort Cumberland in Maryland, but all the way to Philadelphia. In July, to winter quarters, with the campaigning season barely half done. This decision, indefensible by almost any military standard, and recognized as such by colonial governors and military authorities on both sides of the Atlantic, was the second catastrophe of the Monongahela campaign. And it was the one that the British military establishment worked hardest to explain away. Consider what Dunbar's retreat meant in practice. It meant that the entire western frontier of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia was suddenly stripped of regular military protection at the exact moment when the French and their allies, energized by a triumph that no one had predicted, were in a position to raid it at will. And raid it they did. Through the autumn of 1755 and into 1756, frontier settlements from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas were devastated. Families were killed, homesteads were burned. The human cost of Dunbar's decision rippled through the colonial frontier for years. But in the official reports going back to London, the story looked different. The after-action reporting on the Battle of the Monongahela was from the very beginning shaped by the institutional imperatives of the British military bureaucracy, an organization that had survived for centuries partly through its extraordinary ability to absorb disaster without ever quite admitting it. The reports that reached the Duke of Newcastle, the Secretary of State, and ultimately King George II were not fabrications in the crude sense. The facts of the battle were not openly lied about. What happened instead was more sophisticated and, in many ways, more damaging to historical understanding. The narrative was structured in a way that distributed blame downward and outward, away from the command decisions that had actually produced the catastrophe. Braddock was dead, which made him convenient. His rigidity, his contempt for colonial advice, his failure to adapt his tactics, these were real failures, and acknowledging them cost the living nothing. But the blame as it trickled through official channels stopped at Braddock and went no further. Dunbar's retreat was described in terms that emphasized the disorder of the surviving troops, the impossibility of maintaining a frontier position with demoralized regulars, the logistical impracticalities of continued campaigning, the institutional failures, the inadequate scouting, the contempt for intelligence, the absence of any coherent system for adapting European tactics to American conditions, were simply not discussed. The colonial survivors told a different story. Washington, in his letters and later in his recollections, was careful but revealing. He described the rigidity of European tactics in terms that made clear he understood exactly why the column had been destroyed. That standing in lines in a forest, firing at smoke, against an enemy that refused to stand still and be shot at, was not bravery but institutional blindness. Provincial. Officers who survived wrote home with a clarity about what had happened that the official dispatches conspicuously lacked. Some of this correspondence was preserved, some of it was not. The papers captured with Braddock's baggage were particularly troubling to the British. Among them were documents that revealed the full scope of British military planning in North America. Strategic intentions, supply arrangements, the names of colonial informants. The French published some of these documents, naturally, using them for propaganda purposes. The British response was to dispute their authenticity, to claim they had been altered, to muddy the evidentiary waters in ways that made it genuinely difficult for contemporaries, and for historians 2 centuries later, to assess exactly what the documents said and what they meant. There is a pattern in institutional cover-ups that repeats across centuries in cultures with remarkable consistency. First, control the initial narrative. Second, allow enough time to pass that witnesses age and memory fades. Third, permit a sanitized version of events to calcify into official history. The Battle of the Monongahela followed this pattern with almost textbook precision. By the time serious historical scholarship began to examine the battle in the 19th century, as American historians, newly confident in their national identity, began systematically excavating the colonial period. The primary British military sources had been in archives for 100 years. The men who had survived the battle were long dead. The colonial officers, whose accounts might have complicated the official narrative, had left letters and diaries. But these were scattered across private collections, many of them unpublished. The French sources were in Paris, largely inaccessible to English-speaking researchers. What emerged in the popular American telling of Braddock's defeat was a story with a clear moral shape. British arrogance met American wilderness, and American wilderness won. The story was useful to American national mythology because it positioned the colonial experience, and specifically Washington's survival and cool-headedness, as evidence that Americans were fundamentally different from, and in military matters superior to, their British overlords. It was a story that served the Revolution, served the New Republic, served the emerging sense of American exceptionalism. But this popularized version, while emotionally satisfying, was in its own way a distortion. It took a complex institutional failure, one that involved problems of intelligence, command culture, tactical doctrine, logistics, and intercolonial cooperation, and reduced it to a simple morality tale about pride. It erased the French tactical genius. It minimized the decisive role of France's Native American allies. It turned the warriors who had destroyed a British army into background figures, obstacles, or instruments, rather than the central actors in one of the most complete military victories in the history of the continent. And it buried the question that the official British reports had been designed to prevent anyone from asking too loudly. Not just why Braddock failed, but why the entire British military establishment had sent him into the wilderness without adequate intelligence, without appropriate tactical preparation, without a realistic doctrine for the warfare he would face. And then, when the inevitable catastrophe occurred, why it had closed ranks around the disaster rather than learning from it. The answer, when historians in the latter half of the 20th century finally assembled enough of the documentary record to ask the question properly, was institutional. The British Army of 1755 was not designed for self-criticism. It was designed for self-perpetuation. The officers who wrote the after-action reports were officers who expected to have careers after the campaign. The officials who compiled the dispatches for London were officials whose institutional positions depended on the health of the institutions they served. The truth about the Monongahela, that a British army had been effectively destroyed by an enemy it had systematically underestimated, employing tactics that the British had been warned about and had chosen to ignore, was a truth that the system was not capable of generating. Ask yourself this, honestly. If you had survived that battle, if you had lived through those hours of fire and screaming, and the absolute dissolution of everything you had been trained to believe about how war worked. What would you write in your report? Would you write the truth, knowing that the truth implicated not just the dead general, but the entire military philosophy of the empire you served? Or would you write something that preserved your career, preserved the institution, preserved the comfortable myth that the disaster had been an aberration rather than a symptom? Most of the survivors chose the latter, and that choice, multiplied across dozens of officers and officials and political figures, produced a silence that lasted not 50 years, but closer to 200. The fuller reckoning began to emerge in the mid-20th century when historians like Lee McArdle and later Fred Anderson, working with newly available French archival sources alongside the colonial American documentary record, began to reconstruct the battle with a completeness that earlier scholarship had not achieved. Anderson's monumental work on the 7 Years' War, published at the turn of the 21st century, placed the Battle of the Monongahela in a context that made the institutional failure fully visible for the first time. Not as a story about one arrogant general, but as a story about an empire that could not adapt its military culture to the realities of North American warfare. And that paid for this inability with a catastrophe it then spent generations explaining away. The French documents, when fully translated and compared against British sources, revealed the gap between what had actually happened and what official British accounts described. They showed that Beaujeu's force had not stumbled accidentally upon Braddock's column, as some early British accounts suggested, but had moved out of Fort Duquesne with a specific tactical plan. They showed that the battle had not been a simple ambush, but a sophisticated tactical engagement in which French officers maintained command control over a mixed force in complex terrain. A significant military achievement that the British accounts, by characterizing the engagement primarily as the work of undisciplined savages, had effectively erased. The erasure was not accidental. It served the narrative of excusable defeat. You cannot expect European soldiers to counter the chaos of savages, but you can certainly expect them to counter an organized French tactical operation. One version suggested the impossible. The other invited the question of what better preparation might have achieved. The Native American perspective, the actual experience of the warriors who had made the victory possible, remained the most thoroughly buried element of the story. Their accounts, passed through oral tradition within their own nations, were rarely collected by European or American historians during the critical 19th century period when national historical narratives were being assembled. When they did surface in the documentary record, they surfaced in the reports of missionaries, traders, and colonial agents who were not neutral observers and who filtered what they heard through their own cultural assumptions. The full restoration of Native American agency in the story of the Monongahela, understanding the battle not as a backdrop to Washington's formation or Braddock's failure, but as a significant military and political achievement by sovereign nations defending their territorial interests, has been the work of the most recent generation of historians, and it remains incomplete. The implications of what had been covered, softened, and mythologized did not stay safely confined to the history books. They bled, as military lessons left unlearned always bleed, into the subsequent decades of American military and political history. The failure to honestly reckon with what went wrong at the Monongahela, the tendency to reduce it to individual failure rather than systemic failure, to find a scapegoat rather than reform a doctrine, echoed through every subsequent American encounter with unconventional warfare. The same pattern appeared in the early years of the Revolutionary War, as Continental Army commanders initially clung to European tactical conventions against a British enemy that was itself, by then, far better adapted to North American conditions than it had been in 1755. It appeared in the Indian Wars of the 19th century, in engagements where American commanders who had never seriously absorbed the lessons of the Monongahela made eerily similar assumptions about the relationship between European military organization and frontier combat. It appeared in later conflicts on other continents, in other generations, in other uniforms. Whenever an institutional military culture proved more invested in preserving its own self-image than an honest assessment of failure. This is not coincidence. This is what happens when the first link in a chain of learning is deliberately weakened. The British military of 1755 chose myth over analysis. The American military of the Republic inherited that choice, along with the mythology of frontier simplicity that surrounded it. The lesson that should have been drawn from the Monongahela, that adaptive, decentralized tactics employed by fighters with intimate knowledge of their terrain will consistently defeat larger, better-equipped forces organized around rigid doctrine, was available. It was right there, in the blood, in the baggage, and the smashed artillery pieces left on the road south from the Monongahela. But you cannot learn a lesson that the institutional record has been arranged to obscure. Braddock's grave at Great Meadows was rediscovered in 1804 when road construction disturbed the site. The same road, the same route, now being improved for the new nation. His remains were reinterred with military honors, and by that point he had been dead for nearly 50 years, long enough for the anger to have faded into something more comfortable. A cautionary tale, a historical footnote, the general who lost because he wouldn't listen to young George Washington. The real story was already buried by then, deeper than the general's bones, beneath layers of official reporting and convenient mythology, and the simple passage of time that makes it so much easier to accept the version of events that the institutions involved have chosen to provide. Washington himself, the man who had been there, who had ridden through the fire, who had watched the army he served destroy itself through institutional blindness, never wrote a comprehensive account of what he had witnessed. His letters are suggestive, his later recollections carefully measured. But nowhere in the documentary record does Washington sit down and say plainly what he believed had happened and why. Perhaps he felt it was not his place. Perhaps the complexities of his own subsequent career made honest public assessment of British military culture too politically freighted. Perhaps he simply chose, as so many survivors choose, to carry the full weight of what he knew in silence. The silence itself is evidence. That is the thing about covered truths. They do not disappear. They compress. They grow dense with the weight of everything that has been arranged around them to prevent their emergence. And then decades later, centuries later, when enough of the concealing weight has shifted, through the work of archivists, through the opening of foreign archives, through the slow and unglamorous scholarship of historians who read dispatch books and pension records and supply manifests, in the private letters of minor officers who served in long-forgotten campaigns, the truth reemerges, not all at once, but in fragments, each fragment joining the next until the shape of what actually happened becomes visible. What actually happened on the Monongahela was this. A great empire sent an army into terrain it did not understand. To fight an enemy it refused to study, using methods it could not adapt. And when that army was destroyed, utterly, comprehensively, at a cost that should have triggered fundamental reform, the empire's institutions chose narrative management over honest reckoning. They buried the general. They blamed the dead. They allowed a simplified story to calcify into history, and then they moved on, carrying the unlearned lesson inside them like a splinter that could not be found because no one was willing to acknowledge the wound. The warriors who had stood in the trees and watched a British army dissolve in front of them returned to their nations with something that they already knew, that the land they inhabited was not merely geography, but strategy, that knowing a landscape deeply was a form of power that European military organization had not yet learned to respect. Most of them would not have described it in those terms, but they had demonstrated it on a July afternoon with a thoroughness that left 456 men dead in the road and changed the trajectory of a continent. The last of the major archival work on the Monongahela campaign was completed within living memory. Scholars are still finding documents. The French military archives in Vincennes, France, still yield occasional new perspectives. The oral traditions of the nations whose warriors fought that afternoon are still being listened to with something approaching the scholarly seriousness they deserve. The picture continues to assemble itself, slowly, against the resistance of 2.5 centuries of deliberate and accidental obscuration. And here is what remains after all of it. On a summer afternoon in 1755, in a forest that no longer exists, beside a river that still flows south to the Ohio, something happened that the people responsible for it could not afford to fully explain. So they explained it partially, they explained it carefully, they explained it in ways that served the institutions that had produced it, and let the rest sink into the unmarked ground beside Braddock's Road. We are still digging. The screaming has been over for 2.5 centuries, but if you know where to listen, in the archives, in the scholarship, in the oral traditions that refuse to be erased, you can still hear the echo of what the official record was designed to muffle. And that echo, faint as it is, carries a question that every generation has to answer for itself. What is the cost of a truth that an institution cannot afford to tell? And who pays it, if not the men left dead in the road while their reports are being written? Think about that. The next time you read an official account of a military failure, the next time an after-action report arrives and the story it tells feels a little too clean, a little too containable, with the blame distributed a little too conveniently among the dead. Think about Braddock's Road. Think about the silence that settled over the Monongahela, like the fog that rolled in from the river on the morning of July 9th, 1755, and did not lift, not fully, not honestly, for more than 200 years. Some silences are accidents, some are weather, and some are policy. This one was policy.